great. Thank you both for very informative briefings. But so straight away, I'd like to pick on Scott. Scott, was that overwhelming? Do you feel a lot of work coming on? Well, there's going to be some great expectations from here.
I actually think it's empowering. It's empowering for us just to really think about the sort of issues that we are being confronted with. But also, I think a theme that came through in relation to both of John and John's presentations, but picking up from the presentations we had this morning, is the importance of the collectivism that we have, the importance of us sharing and talking and making sure that collectively we can respond to these challenges, whether it's the challenge in the context of food defense or the challenge in the context of food fraud. And I think from both of our presentations we've just heard, we see the sort of difference in some way in the nature and the characteristics of both of those concepts and both of those challenges. But fundamentally, it is how we can collectively respond to that and actually deliver on what is the most important aspect in terms of, ultimately, it is the trust and confidence of the public and consumers in the products and in the food that we're talking about. And whether it's an issue of food fraud or food defense, fundamentally they undermine and cut away the trust and confidence that the consumers and public have. And I think probably what we see, and again building upon what we heard this morning, is the overarching focus that I think we all bring to the table and we need to continue to bear in mind is the trust and confidence, the health and well-being of consumers. And that's the unifying thing that I think brings us into play of a sense, as I said, this is quite an empowering discussion.
Fantastic. John, closest to me here, what are some of the gaps in when you look at industry and they're developing food defense plans? Are you seeing gaps in those plans? Or some things that you're not...
I guess the way I'm going to answer that is that I mentioned some tools that are available on FDA's website from the standpoint of doing assessments, risk assessments, and some of the mitigation. A lot of that work was done really starting in about 2003, 4, 5. And what's happened recently, and this is where I think there's probably some work to be done, two things have sort of reared their head. And I think as soon as I say one of them, you're all going to nod your heads, and that's cybersecurity. We've seen a major increase in that threat. And when we go into food plants, they've got no cybersecurity program at all. We've had discussions where some of the people within Homeland Security have told me they've actually tried to work their way into a food plant, and of the 10 plants they tried, they were successful in every single one of them. What hasn't been done, and they want to try this, is whether or not they can work their way into your system, modify your process controller so that it looks like it's still functioning, but in fact it's not meeting the intentional critical control points. They think they can do that. That I think is an area that the industry as a whole really needs to start to address. The other one, which I personally am not that aware of, but I've heard it's increasing, and I don't know if it's true in New Zealand, is cargo theft. In the US, we actually have instances of hot zones all across the United States where we know that if cargo trucks go through those zones, the probabilities are a lot higher that their trucks would potentially be stolen. And then the risk is what happens to that food? Do you know whether or not that gets contaminated somehow during that process of having stolen and resold? And the beauty of food, and that's why it's high on the list of steal, is that it's almost untraceable. You know, if I've got a bunch of hams, how do I know that it's stolen or not stolen? Mm-hmm. And I go to a farmer's market and they're gone within a few hours. And those are two things that I think of that from the standpoint of the current risk assessments that I've seen, are really lacking.
So cargo theft and cybersecurity, it's very interesting. John, if I can bounce over to you for a moment. The area of forensic accounting, it seems to me to be another area that may be missing, certainly when you're dealing with suppliers that are offshore. Can you maybe elaborate on the relevance of forensic accounting as a discipline that organizations should focus on?
Well, and I've been fortunate to work with the University of Portsmouth in the UK, and they have a counter-fraud accounting center. And they've pointed out, working together on forensic accounting, but forensic auditing as well. So basically in the forensic accounting and auditing area, they look for where there could be opportunities for fraud in those type of accounting situations. And so if you know, same with looking at a supply chain, if you know where there could be a sleight of hand, then you can be more vigilant at that point. And so that's a real key. And these people are accustomed to looking at the networks in a certain way. So again, it's forensic accounting looking at the money, but also the audit of how we're even tracking it.
That's right, and that assessment that University of Portsmouth have done, I think they've come up with a number they've tracked fraud in the UK over the last 15 years, and I believe it's 5.47% of revenue is attributed to fraud of all sorts within companies in the UK. And that's an astronomical number when you take that out to what consumers pay for products. So
mind-boggling.
It's absolutely mind-boggling. Is there anyone here from an academic institution, maybe Massey? Your academic institution? Yeah. So we know that Massey and other organizations are critical to train the future leaders. Can you maybe comment on that in your role? You talked about thinking like a criminal. How important is it for us to educate the future food safety leaders, the students, into thinking like a criminal to do their job a little bit better?
Oh, really? Actually, and that's what, from the start, we've been working with a lot, we do a lot of food safety education and outreach at Michigan State, and so capacity building is the concept. So providing the opportunities for people to just learn a little bit about it, and then to have more resources as they move forward. So to follow on Frank's discussion of education versus training, training might be how to do a vulnerability assessment down the list. Education is understanding your system and your network. So we've looked at this from both sides of growing that. And what we're trying to do is create those one-off modules that then can be incorporated into other programs. So Queen's University Belfast uses some of our modules, or MOOC, as a resource. And the key starting point is, as happened with enterprise risk management, is a common set of terminology and standards and practices. So we've started to do more of that and trying to get it out as much as possible, both in that non-credit on-demand type system, all the way through to this master's type program. And so we're looking at that of how to build this overall capability. And so for instance, I teach a class, anti-counterfeiting and product protection. Covers all products. There's 2 weeks on criminal justice. So we go through CJ 101, situational crime prevention, in general, routine activities theory, all these different types of crime theories. Then we move on to risk and have 2 weeks on risk. ISO 31000, looking at decision sciences, what goes on there. Supply chain 101, to start looking at networks. And it's actually shocking sometimes, and especially in the one-on-one situations where we're having executive education, where someone will all of a sudden think, now, if I send a product through a free trade zone, could that be a little bit vulnerable? And they realize, well, there's no, they now have learned about free trade zones, there's no oversight there. And then they realize these risks. And it's not rocket science. It's basics. So I think that's a part of academia to continue to expand. What are those core disciplines? Provide people that base education, but at the same time, all the way through implementation.
Gotcha. Now, just a further follow-on, a quick question. Do you think it would be valuable for organizations here within New Zealand to get a team together, multidisciplinary team within their organizations, and look at every possible criminal act that could occur, either to steal the product or to contaminate the product? So would workshops like that valuable?
Yeah.
Thinking like a criminal?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that when we lay those out, all of a sudden there's maybe a belief at the beginning that, oh, this is, okay, how long am I going to be here? What time's lunch? But then it lays out and it's revealed where these vulnerabilities are. And we constantly have meetings that are supposed to be long, and 15 minutes in, they realize they're terrified. They realize, yes, this is a huge problem we need to deal with, but there's also a process and a system to address it.
Gotcha.
So,
Scott, What keeps you up at night when you hear all of this stuff? What are the? I know the minister and Martin will have you under pressure and all of that, so you don't have to have all the answers today. But you know, what's top of mind for you when you're thinking about food fraud, food defence?
Well, I think fundamentally, and we've touched upon it already. I mean, what's top of mind is really how we pull this together to respond to what is in front of us, so that consumers, mums and dads, the guardians of the most vulnerable, whether they're young infants or the elderly, can have the requisite degree of trust and confidence that they can continue to go and purchase the product. And I think if you reflect back on a lot of what we've spoke about here, it is really how we can respond to those, dare I say it, challenges that we get confronted with on a day-to-day basis. And probably just picking up on what John was just saying, is it's also the importance of just making sure that we have a culture where we are sharing and talking with each other. And you think about how Frank sort of really put to the core this notion of food safety culture. I mean, to me, I look across all of the food matrix and the concepts that John took us through. On all of those aspects, what we want is a culture where we feel enabled and empowered to be able to talk and to share the insights that we have. Because I think fundamentally, when we try to presume in our own selves that we know how a supply chain operates, or presume in our own minds that we know exactly how a company or someone else is going to respond, then I think we're doing all of ourselves a bit of a disservice. That the more we can actually share and talk and reach out, much like as Alan highlighted in terms of some of the questions he had of if only someone at the time when they first spotted something awry reached out and shared that intelligence, that would have been so much more powerful for the system as a whole. And I think from my perspective, that's what I see when I think about these threats that we're confronted with in relation to whether it's food safety, food defense, food fraud, or anything in between. It's actually how we have empowered ourselves and made sure we have an environment that we can talk to each other.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Building on that, John, when you analyze food defense issues in the US, are you seeing similar patterns and characteristics when you do the analysis?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I think one of the things that we're seeing patterns of is that the disgruntled employee sort of comes to the top when there's a defense-related incident. That happens more often than just about anything else. Right. And I think it gets back to the fact that for somewhere along the line, some breakdown occurred within that culture for that disgruntled employee to all of a sudden feel like they need to lash out and hurt somebody.
Right. So look over your shoulder at work. I guess that's the key message.
I was hoping, can I have a second?
Absolutely.
I was just going to sort of comment on the educational question.
Yes.
Is one of the things that I think would be good here is we actually have resources from Homeland Security, and they sponsor students to come and sit with us. So that instead of us actually trying to find money and attach a student to it, they will give us money specifically for the student, not for anything else, but for that student, so that they can sit with us and be trained into that next generation food defense type individual. Gotcha. And I think that's a worthwhile program.
John, I had the pleasure of being on the Asian version of the vulnerability assessment development, and we were all a little bit uncomfortable when some of the criminology questions included to look at the car the purchasing manager is driving and the sales manager, and look at their lifestyles, multiplications, big house, new swimming pool, and so on and so forth. And these things come up. The criminologists wanted these in the vulnerability assessments. But how do you approach that? Can we arrest our way or prosecute our way out of these types of issues?
First off, enforcement is critical and important. We need to investigate, but we're never going to arrest our way to safety. Because even fraud is, and morals and ethics are situational. And people can justify what they're doing. If they're close to the plant shutting down, then they may may look at things a little bit differently. So the enforcement's important, but not the key. What's come up a number of times with different vulnerability assessments, but the ones that have come to be very academic, ask very logical, rational academic questions that sometimes can be near impossible in practice to answer. So you've got, but they're logical questions. And a key with sometimes is the traditional criminology studies the criminal itself and trying to understand them and predict that a bit. But then the other side is situational crime prevention. And that's changing the space of crime. And that actually is great because it removes the criminal and the human from the dynamic of their background. If it's not a fraud opportunity, there's not a fraud opportunity. And that's a real key, is shifting those resources to how we lead bad guys to believe there's a chance that they're going to get caught, or that it's going to cost them more to do it. Because they might be able to find the next melamine, but if it costs twice as much, they might decide, let's just make the genuine product. Or we're not going to send that to New Zealand. Going to Australia. Oh no, that's it.
I've learned they say here across the ditch.
Okay, across the ditch.
I'm
learning.
Yeah. So on that, is resource allocation and decision making or decision criteria, is that vital for organizations?
So much of, I think what's happened, and so my background is packaging and food safety, and it's interesting when we look at something from a food safety violation. Say there's usually a regulation that tells you how much is okay and not. So if you find one spore of CBOT, or you don't have a 5-log reduction, you must respond. There's no, somebody made a qualitative decision. Why not 6-log? Why not 4.5? But a key is that there's a regulation. But then when we've got some of these new emerging risks, it's a little softer of how much is vulnerable for a network. And the key that happened is I think a lot of the traditional food safety methodology moved forward, but we ran into the situation where we didn't have a high is undefined. And I like the slide of, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. A lot of those assessments move forward that way. What was missing is something that's actually common in business, is that enterprise risk, some decision-making structure. And we saw with even intellectual property rights in the US, created an IPEC, Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator's Office. They went to Congress, and for us, everyone in Congress was arms locked, hugging each other. I mean, the people that are polar opposites were ready to give them money. And they asked, how big's the problem? They said, well, we don't really know, it's pretty bad. And they said, well, come back when you know. And that was the key. Is that, again, the enterprise was a company, and they couldn't express. They had the left and the right, the up and the down. Everybody was together, but they didn't have a decision-making process. Enterprise risk management can do that because it then is a tool for you to compare that risk compared to other risks. So inside a company, the thing that's been key is that you as a company, you do your own vulnerability assessment. And that's your specific vulnerability, and you compare that to your own vulnerabilities within your company. CFOs are accustomed to making those type of decisions. Even very qualitative risks, vulnerabilities, they're used to that. But we're used to giving them the kind of black and white, there is a spore, there's not.
John, would you agree that resource allocation is vital to the area of food defense?
Oh, yeah. One of the things I think that we've seen with the companies that we deal with is that food defense, since it's a low probability, they just don't want to put in the resources to actually put together the plan or the mitigation steps to. Now, there's some companies that do. I mean, they've invested heavily in it. But as the companies get smaller, then it becomes out of sight, out of mind. They just won't have the ability to be able to do that. They're fighting so much on the food safety side, they can't devote their resources to the food defense side.
Now, the food fraud is counter criminal. Food defense is counter terrorist. Can it be the same resource, or do you need specific skills on those areas?
Who are we asking?
It doesn't matter. Anyone.
Well, I would say that all the activities that are food protection are on a continuum. And so everything you do that increases traceability and transparency for food quality, for organic, for whatever, that makes it harder for the bad guy to slip in. You turn on the light and the cockroaches run to the corner. And that's the key. So we really do need to look at these, look at all the activities going on. You don't need a separate set of activities, but maybe you modify one of those activities. I was actually with a company, and I said, well, horse meat had occurred, and then I said, well, what's your current horse meat testing plan? They said, well, we don't test anymore. And I said, well, why? Because the incident went away. said, well, the fraud opportunity is still there, and it just opened wide up again. And they said, well, gosh, what should we do? Well, they don't need to do a lot of tests, but they need to let the bad guys know that you're testing, and you have to be very visible. So why don't you just shoot your 4 suppliers an email saying that you're going to start collecting tests for species tests? And give the sample pack to your auditor. It happened that the next week, an auditor was going to one of their meat suppliers. And so the key is that if they just go in and they take the sample, you must do the sample in front of the lab manager, in front of the driver of the truck. Whether he's in on it or not, he's going to see us taking that sample. So that's prevention. It goes, if we did it secretly, then we're just going to catch him. That's prevention, because whether he knows or not, he's communicating back. We don't have to actually do any tests at the start. We should do some, maybe keep retains. Think about it. If someone says they're keeping a species test retain down that could be tested down to 0.01% DNA, and they're going to start in a month, you're going to send some emails in the next 20 minutes, and you're going to send some samples to labs, and you're at that level, you're going to make sure that when they start possibly sampling, it's not your product. And everything's fine. You're gonna check with your suppliers. That's the prevention piece. And they're trying to avoid getting caught. And so if we understand the thinking of how other business people, criminal business people think, we can put minor programs in place. How much is that going to cost them for additional sample testing? Not a lot. And that auditor's already there. It's a few minutes for them to take that sample. And again, if they're not actually doing the test every time, then it's the cost of collecting the retains. And that does truly, you can believe it in your heart and your soul, that's prevention. Think about yourself. They tell you you see them taking retains. That's prevention. So, sorry.
Scott, I feel for you. He's
just going to start taking retains.
You could have picked any chair here, but you went right in between the food defense expert and a food fraud expert, and you're getting it literally in each ear. Well, what are the challenges that you see as a regulator? And when you look at, right across the spectrum from a policy perspective, but also resource allocation in real terms, what kind of preparedness do you need to do on the policy side, and how will you engage with industry?
Well, I think probably, if you think about one of the words you used there, John, preparedness, I mean, that's fundamental to how you need to think about this. And really building on what we've heard is there is a continuum here. It's all connected. Whilst you'll have some variation in terms of some of the motives or the incentives behind whether it's food fraud, food defense, or issues around food safety and the like, fundamentally from our perspective, what pervades everything there is what we are doing from a regulatory standpoint with industry, with our partners like Assure Quality, to make sure we've got the right information in place so we can actually detect, try to push the prevention down the channel more. And some of that does play out off the back of some of the issues we're confronted with. And obviously, as you've heard from Minister Goodhue and also Martin earlier, late last year we had a criminal blackmail threat raise its head. That played out publicly earlier this year. And when we were first made aware of that, that was clear from our perspective what we needed to do collectively with all the relevant players was to ensure that when we were going to talk publicly to mums and dads and the consumers, that they could see and appreciate that we had done everything within our power to give them trust and confidence that the supply chain was secure and they could continue to purchase infant and other formula, which is obviously very important for the babies and the infants. And if you look at that basis in terms of the drive to make sure we're prepared for that eventuality, that we have the planning in place, complemented by some very effective world-leading testing and monitoring regimes, so people can appreciate that we have actually been testing quite significantly, that it is negative, and this third party, this criminal actor, has not actually had the opportunity to interfere with the supply chain. That was crucial. In terms of the resource allocation, again, I mean, from our perspective, it is a continuum. And we need to be aware to make sure all parts of our organization as the regulator is ready. and also thinking proactively, whether it is in the policy context, to make sure that our policy and legislative frameworks are actually fit for purpose and ready to help us and support us in terms of responding. But more fundamentally, as I said, it's really for all of us to be part of that conversation on an ongoing basis, that we're not waiting for these sort of incidents to crop up, for this third party, a criminal player, to seek to harm the most vulnerable. What we want to ensure is each day we have the sort of informed, strong, constructive conversation that we all deserve to have, that we can make sure we're continuously improving the processes and our awareness and our intelligence to make sure we are aware of issues as they're emerging, and then we can get on and really front foot that to give consumers every trust and confidence that we are transparent, we're upfront, we're honest, and when we're aware of a problem, we're going to front it.
So building on that, John, you mentioned that a lot of the detection of an event occurs at the tail end, right? You know about it basically too late.
Yeah.
Are there any methods or techniques to kind of shorten the life cycle of detection? I know you're working on that area.
Yeah, I mentioned that there's a program we're working on we call it FIDES, which is designed just around that.
Right.
And it's not necessarily looking at the primary factors. It's looking at all these surrounding aspects of events that might come together and allow us to predict something in the future. For example, one of the studies that we did recently, it turned out that there wasn't a risk, but people probably weren't thinking in terms of a food-related incident when the Ebola problem was happening last year. Well, when you look at that, what you find on a food perspective is that the largest producer or area of production of cocoa is in that area. And what was happening was, because of the way the countries were dealing with the spread of the issue, they were shutting borders down that were preventing workers to move from one harvest to another. And so all of a sudden you had this real major decrease in cocoa production, which would create this avenue or opportunity for someone to go in and actually do something that might end up either being just fraud or a health hazard. And that's the type of program that hopefully would lead us to not really, I don't think we can conceivably guarantee that we'll know in advance, but it'll start raising red flags and cause us to be a little bit more focused logically and strategically from the standpoint of what is happening, so that we can know a little bit more prior to the event.
John, a question for you on public-private partnerships. We heard it from Scott, we heard it from John, that the public and private partnerships can work. What is your opinion on that? What are you seeing evolving?
It's been amazing. In the state of Michigan, where I'm from, we have a public-private partnership, started really food defense, but food safety in general. We meet 3 times a year and we clear our calendars to get together. And the thing's been great is, it's like dating, maybe. You know, you meet someone, you think you kind of like them, and you maybe go a little closer. Over time, we've got so close. And we know what the state can ask and not ask, and they're comfortable with us. But the big thing is that we're dealing with issues very early on, very high levels. It's not so much about picking which place to audit, but they're strategic, very at the high level. And I think there's also an importance. The way that we started was on very much the strategic side. So it was a safer environment to not worry about, well, you would have to worry about what you heard, and I would have to worry about what I said. But when we start very high, and I think it would be something like, well, for us it was food defense originally, and then now with food fraud as well, to say broadly, what should we do as a public-private partnership? What's the role of each of us? Because the associations and the people like GFSI, individual companies, academics, and different government, both local, state, and federal, they all have a role. And at that point, you start to looking at everybody's role across the entire spectrum. And with everything is so much more efficient when we do really work together. And so we need to figure that.
Thank you, John. Now, John Larkin, you had a choice of 3 seats as well, and you picked this one. So I'm going to give you the limelight for 20
Okay,
seconds with the ministers over there.
So I'm the Frank of.
Yeah, you're the Frank. So
Okay.
you're having a private consultation now. You know, all of New Zealand is looking at you. The minister is there,
Yeah.
and this is being recorded.
Oh.
No pressure, no pressure. What in 20 seconds? What are the tips? What is the outcome that you want to share with the minister about food defense?
Yeah, I appreciate the question because I sort of tried to do that in the presentation, and I guess I just want to reiterate is this whole aspect of transparency and communication. We recently had a meeting where we got together and we were talking about some research needs in the area of just detection. How can we improve our ability to detect agents in foods? And the government individuals in the room almost united said our biggest problem is communication. Now it's not the communication that it's not there. They've already related with each other. That's the first barrier is to get the people together, because I think what happens is when they start developing the relationships, they're a little bit freer. They're not so turf oriented. But in this particular case, what they were referring to wasn't that. It was the fact that policy was preventing the information from moving from one group to the other. And if you can nail that down and get that out of your headache, that's going to be a major boon for just being able to do what you just described. Because it's not just the foods. I mean, you got to get your law enforcement people in, you got to get your intelligent people in, you got to get your emergency response people in there. And they all have policies as to what communication can go, and it's sensitive. Then you start hitting barriers. And then people don't know what's all going on, and it doesn't allow them. So I don't know how to solve that problem. I really don't. But if there's a way, I think from a government level to solve that, that's going to really help in the long term.
Thank you very much. And with that, for people, staff here from MPI, I'm sensing new job titles coming down the pipeline. I would like to thank the panel, and then I'd like to welcome Scott up to the chairman role again. But thank you to the panel.